Hey there. So what we're going to be looking at here is Chapter 8. Chapter 8, we're going to be looking at, well, sort of culture. This is more of a socio-cultural chapter. We're going to be talking about Republican culture. Understand this has nothing to do with a political party. This is about the idea of republicanism, meaning America is a republic, a nation where the government is supposed to protect the population, protect the citizenry. That's what we mean like of a republic. So this has nothing to do with politics. We're going to be looking at 30 years here, 1790 to 1820. The next couple chapters will cover the same time period, a similar time period with different topics during this chapter, during the next, about the next three chapters. We'll be looking at different things in the same time period in our new America. So we are calling this a democratic Republican culture. Again, Republic has nothing to do with politics, and Democrat doesn't have anything to do with political party either. Neither of these political parties exist at this time, what we think of as Democrat or Republican. Well, we're going to be looking at really two important things in this chapter. We will be talking about slavery, of course, and I say of course because that's just about every chapter from now on. We'll be touching on the topic of slavery. And we'll also be talking about what it means to be a Republican, to be a Republican person, not a political party. So we will start to see opportunity and equality, but it should be clear it is for white men. It is not for Native Americans, African Americans, and it's not really for women either. However, what is really amazing about this is we do create a society which has pretty much near equality for all free white men. That is not the case in most places in the world in 1800. And why it is so significant is this idea of freedom and equality for all white men. Eventually, those same ideals will be used to extend freedom and equality to people of color and women, minorities, immigrants. So regarding our current time period, if you try to think of it as of today, it doesn't seem fair or equal at all. In 1800, it was actually one of the most fair and equal societies on the planet. Just something to think about how much has changed in the last 200 years. Well, one of the things that drives this is an emerging middle class in America. Previously, in most of society, as it was back in Europe, you pretty much had two classes. You had the lower and the upper order. The notables, which were the upper class, where everyone knew who they were in their local community, and then you had everybody else, the common man and woman, who was the vast majority of the population. Well, we start to have a new middle class. And with the new middle class in America comes some interesting things. We start to see culture, education start to seep into this new middle class America, not just the rich and wealthy. We see political equality for the middle class. And further, we also have social mobility. America is truly one of the few places in the world in this time period that you could start literally at the bottom, homeless, penniless, and you could work your way up the ladder all the way to success and prosperity in our country. It really was that way. And many people see it as that. And that's one of the driving forces behind immigration. This idea that America is truly a place of opportunity for anyone from any part in the world. It starts to really drive immigration to this country, along with other things. There was also a belief that there was no aristocracy. There was no elite royal type class in America, which was different than, well, most of the world. And people like that. People like the idea that there's no set in stone upper class ceiling that you can never get past. In truth, there certainly was social classes in America. There certainly was. It isn't nearly as rosy as some might have thought, to where anyone and everyone could be successful and have their dreams. No, it wasn't quite like that. But it still was a place where even if half the people that came here could live their dreams and be successful and have anything they wanted, that was still an order of magnitude, 10 times more than in most places of the world. In most places in the world, 90% of the population, whatever social status you were born at, economic status, you were going to die in that same place. You were never going to be able to elevate yourself. So even if half the people to America, only half, were able to elevate their status and go up the social ladder, that still is an incredible feat when you consider the time period of 1800, when in almost everywhere else in the world, especially Europe, you were not going anywhere. There was no social mobility. It simply didn't exist, except for maybe 5%. So something to think about. Personal achievement versus hereditary wealth was significant. Uh, People cheered personal achievement, basically raising yourself up from the bottom to become successful and comfortable. It doesn't mean like wealthy and powerful, but just becoming successful and you know, climbing the social ladder through your own personal achievement, lifting yourself up. People frowned upon hereditary wealth. And this is this idea of the aristocratic class. They frowned upon people who inherited their wealth or were given their money or came from a proud family. They might have respected them simply because it was part of the social requirement, but they really truly respected the people who were able to start at the bottom and work their way up to the top. Uh, those who worked and deserved their accomplishments. And that is sort of became part of the American dream. The idea of what we will call later, I don't know if I've really mentioned it yet, the idea of the self-made man. That really becomes commonplace in American culture in the 19th century. Well, laws in this nation and cultural rules always had existed. Remember, where do our ideas and laws and culture really come from? Europe. At this point in time, almost everybody in America was either born in Europe or descended from Europeans. So our law codes, our traditions, all came from European society. And in European society, people of color, minorities, and women had long been oppressed. It was simply the way it was in European society. So the opportunities to advance and lift yourself up if you were a woman or a black person were certainly limited in 1800. Very, very difficult. Race, gender discrimination was common. These were written into the law codes and also simply by tradition, argument, custom, biology. Arguments in biology were made all the time that, well, men were just superior to women. Men were just smarter than women. White was simply superior to black. This had been custom and tradition in European society, well, forever. Certainly men versus women, and in the last several centuries, white versus black. Um, this leads us into something we call social Darwinism. We're not going to talk about that at this point. That would be much later in time, but it's the same century. The same century is this idea of how race is significant, gender is significant, and all that really matters are white men. This is a leading sociocultural principle in this century across Europe and America. Women and blacks are kept from voting. They're kept from owning property. They often use religion to justify this as well, talking about how, because religion is mentioned in the Bible many, many times, pardon me, slavery was the word I meant to say there. Slavery is mentioned in the Bible many, many times. And so it was often justified by whites saying, well, slavery is in the Bible, therefore what's wrong with us having slaves? And slaves are black, so what's the deal? I don't understand what's the problem with it. So religion was often used to justify slavery. Religion was also used to justify oppression of women. The fact that women in the Bible, it's very clear that men were supposed to be superior. Women were to be subservient. Women were to be obedient like children to the husband, to the father. So religion is often used. These arguments, biology, custom, and religion are often used to justify oppression, violence, discrimination against minorities and women. So nothing is really changing in this time period. However, as I said at the beginning, the fact that this does become a place for opportunity and equality for white men, that will actually, within the next 100 years, uh, work its way out into minorities, into women. And we do lead the way, truthfully, in most places in the world, in white equality, black equality, female equality. We uh, we are not by all means we're not the first country to outlaw slavery, but we do outlaw slavery before many other countries. We are one of the first countries to give women the right to vote in the next century. So this does create a foundation for equality and opportunity that will, over the next 100 years, disseminate to the entire mass of the United States to some degree. This shows you the expansion of voting rights here. You can see in time period here, 1800, you had to own property. Pretty much you had to own property to be able to have any voting rights. And as we talked about in previous chapters, the vast majority of property owners, with the exception of New England, but the vast majority of property owners were the upper classes, the notable classes. Most common people do not own property outside of New England. Then 30 years later, all you have to be is a taxpayer. Or even several states give total universal suffrage, suffrage being the right to vote. So we have several states that give total suffrage, regardless if you're simply a white man, you can vote. And then most states actually, all you have to be is a taxpayer. And most people pay taxes. So effectively, by 1830, with the exception of Tennessee, North Carolina, and it looks like Rhode Island, all the rest of America, pretty much if you're a white man paying taxes, as most do, you can vote. That is unusual anywhere in the world. In 1830, the vast majority of the population in any country in the world could not actively participate in politics. Now we have most Americans, white men, can participate in politics. It is a very big step forward. It truly is for this time period. So the next thing we're going to look at is a Republican marriage system. Again, what does it mean to be married and have a family in this new Republic of America? Well, lots of debate about this. Lots of debate about what authority and political rights women should have, or should they have any at all. Women wanted rights. Women talked about having rights, but not in large numbers. This wasn't any type of a large swell movement across America about this. There had been a discussion for well over a century that men had natural rights. This is in the Declaration of Independence. It was in arguments made during the Revolution, before and during the Revolutionary War, that men and American citizens had natural rights. Well, here's the thing. They always just assumed the language was always the people and we and men. They never really talked about women. Did women have natural rights? Did women have rights or equality? Should women be treated this way? Well, the general consensus at the time was that natural rights, rights of equality, only really applied to men, white men. Conveniently didn't apply to people of color or women. Now, this was pretty standard at the time, and there isn't really much going on. There isn't much challenging this at the time, truthfully. Well, after the war, the Revolutionary War, we do start to see a few changes in how marriage is conducted, how marriages occur, and then the relationships afterwards. Arranged marriages are decreasing. We're not going to say they don't exist any longer, but we see fewer arranged marriages, and there becomes more a focus on emotions, or the idea of sentimentalism, and companionate marriage. And the discussion was all about, what's rational and logical. Rational and logical would usually say the man has the authority, the man is in charge, as it had always been. Or more of a humanistic approach, human nature, human feelings, emotion. Eventually, this works its way out into what we do call companionate marriage. And that is what we have today. When you marry someone, you choose a companion. You choose someone to spend time with, to spend your life with. It's not about arrangement. It's not about what's best for the family or best for the community. And we will start thinking about the idea of love, that you can actually be in love with someone and you spend your life with someone who you love and you have a family that you love. In today's culture, this, of course, would be nonsense to think otherwise. 200 years ago, it would have been nonsense to think that you should only be with someone because you love them. Arranged marriages would be more about social status, more about need. Also, you must consider many people lived rural lives. Majority of people lived rurally, where your entire life up to 18, marriageable age, you might have only come in contact with 2 or 3 other people who could even be a couple, even be a partner for you, male or female. So arranged marriages were simply more convenient, easier. Weren't a lot of choices back then. So we do start to think more about human needs, human emotion, and this idea of sentimentalism. Now, sentimentalism specifically refers to this idea of emotions, relations to God, relations to caring for each other in nature. So all of this boils down to 1700s, really about arranged marriages, was really about rationalism, logic, and need. And then this increasing idea of humanistic feelings, sentimental feelings about emotion or love, ultimately leads us to this idea of companionate marriage, marriage for love. Now, this sounds good, sounds wonderful, falling in love and finding someone to spend your life with. Well, it sounds good on paper. What is the truth? This truth of love and republicanism, people wrote about it. People talked about it. Newspapers, books, articles, lectures. This new type of love. Well, as more and more of these marriages are based upon love, the theory was that this republicanism, this idea of equality and fairness, would spread through the entire family. Not just the father, but the mother, the children. The entire family would start to feel more of this republican nature of equality and fairness for all. Um, However, what we find is we see this change towards companionate love marriage, and then by 1830s, we actually start to see, even though it is still that type of marriage, we actually start to see that the male authority starts to reassert itself as men start to feel that women are getting too many rights, too many opportunities, women are seeming to have more equality than they should, and we actually see sort of a snapback. By the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, we see increasing patriarchy. We actually see women being pushed back down. Even though they might be married to someone who they chose, it wasn't arranged, that still doesn't mean that there is equality in the home. We actually start to see real, what we would call patriarchal authoritarianism, take hold in most homes. This becomes the dominant way of marriage for the next century. Until the mid 1900s, even a little after than that, we find that most marriages are male dominated, patriarchal, as is most of American society. They're not arranged anymore, but you must understand clearly they're not equal. There was this promise, this little bit of hope in the early 1800s where it seemed like there might be this opportunity for equality for women. And it seems that the male authority in America started to see this happening and shut it down to where we really see women not having any expansion of rights or equality for most of the 19th century. Um, However, arranged marriages do seem to go away, but the equality that seemed like was going to come along with it just doesn't really happen. So what is it to be a mother? What is it to be a mother in this time period, a Republican mother? Well, demographic transition plays directly into this. By the 1790s, birth rates were starting to decline. They were starting to decline. In the 1700s, it was common for women to have 7 or more children. Really common, up to even 10 children. By the early 1800s, so I'm back with you, by the 1700s, because my dog came in. She's so cute. Maybe she'll jump on my lap one of these times. But anyway, so by the 1700s, we've got that 8 to 10. By the early 1800s, it's down to 6. Even though it's out of the time period, the demographic transition continues. By 1900s, it's down to 3, 4 children for every woman. So birth rates are declining, yet population continues to grow. What we find is the population growth for pretty much the rest of American history is driven by immigration. Don't get me wrong, Americans are still having kids, of course, but I'm just saying that the largest chunk of our population growth seems to be focused more on immigration than just on natural birth. We also see decreasing numbers of men in the East. Men are going west. As America expands westward, we see men going westward. We also see people marrying later. Why marrying later? Because they're living a little bit longer. People's life expectancy is increasing a little, not major, but increasing somewhat. Plus, as we start to have that middle Republican class, as I started the chapter with, one of the things that goes hand in hand with that is an increasing education. We start seeing an increased educated middle class in America for the first time. Well, you have to delay marriage if you're going to get an education for a few years. So you see marriages a little bit later. So later marriage, smaller families, fewer children, and of course, there's the simple fact of smaller family. If you have fewer children, you can provide for them better. You can do better. One of the ways to increase your social, not the right word, economic. One of the ways to increase your economic standing in America is simply to have fewer children. Less children means you get to hold on to more of your money, or that money can be diverted into other things, businesses, capital, homes, things like that. So, yeah, we go in a 100-year period, the average family in America drops almost in half. From the late 1700s to 1900, the average family size is cut almost in half. Part of that's due to the increase in cities as well, which I'll get into at another time. Now, another interesting thing is this idea of male versus female sexual nature, which ties into motherhood. For the first time, we start to see many people, leaders, ministers, religious figures, start to shift the focus on women and have the focus more on men and their sexuality. What does that mean? Instead of worrying about women being the reproductive center of the family, having kids, being in charge of the moral guide of the family, they actually see more of a focus on the men. For many people, especially with Christian thought, Republican America was for men. This had two purposes. One, the men are dominant. The men should take charge and control the family and provide for the family, while simultaneously the men are responsible for the failings of the family. So something goes wrong in the family, if your wife cheats, if the family isn't successful, if there's divorce, which was not common, but if a divorce occurs, it's his fault, which is interesting. So with this increased idea of republicanism, we also see increasing responsibility on the men, that men must take more responsibility for their actions. Dr. Benjamin Rush, I don't know if I mentioned him before. He was actually the doctor for George Washington's Continental Army. Well, he was well known, very famous, and he wrote books, he wrote articles, and he detailed what it meant to be a good Republican daughter, a good Republican son, and a good Republican mother. Well, to be a better citizen meant that daughters and sons should be educated. He is probably the first proponent in America for national education, public education. Probably the first national figure to really call for education for all sons and daughters. Now, it should be made clear that daughters should be educated for the purpose of being a better Republican wife. Not to be independent, not to vote, not to avoid marriage, not to even work. But an education means, simply put, your husband should be educated, therefore you should be educated, so you can talk intelligently with him, so you can be aware of what's going on in the public, what's going on with current events. You can talk about books. So you go to Republican wife, a Republican mother, should then raise Republican sons and daughters. Sons, of course, to be leaders. Sons, of course, to be businessmen and be successful. And daughters to be good wives. Now, that is condescending. It certainly is, and it's sexist. For this time period, though, that is the norm. And it should also be understood that there was actually an advantage to this for women. Even though it is condescending and sexist, the key to this is he did advocate for women's education. When in this time period, 80% of women received no type of education beyond primary school. So most women had nothing beyond the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. So the idea of a woman being educated, even though it was not for her benefit necessarily, it was really for the family's benefit, her soon-to-be family, it's still education. Ministers would argue this was where female power laid. Your power as a woman wasn't in leading a home, leading a family, having a job, running a business, being a politician, or voting. Your power as a woman was in being a good Republican mother, in raising good children. In other words, your success as a woman was really based upon how successful your husband and kids were. That is where your power lay. Don't aspire to be more than that. It's the way it was in this time period. All right, Republican children. What about them? We have some interesting ideas here. We do see a demographic shift here in how children are educated and treated. We see 2 different types of parenting. More authoritarian, patriarchal, male-dominated, father specifically, for the poor, tenants, people who don't own land. And then for the middle class and above, people who own property, people who have financial prospects, economic prospects, we see it more permissive, more independent. The idea is simple. If you want your child to grow up to be independent and successful and take care of themselves, you need to allow them to do that as a child. They need to be allowed to make mistakes, fall, hurt themselves, do stupid things, and therefore they will learn and grow and learn how to be successful. As opposed to more of the poor, you were not necessarily expected to go up the social ladder. Therefore, your job as a child was simply to learn to do what your father did, which was to take care of the farm, be a laborer. Or if you were a daughter, your job was simply to learn and do what your mother did, piecework, or just to become a wife and have lots of kids. So very authoritarian and patriarchal for the common person and more permissive independent for the middle class and above. Europe was more of the authoritarian patriarchal. So when many Europeans would come to America and they would see this type of parenting, they would be perplexed because this really only existed for the rich and wealthy, which was, 5% of Europe? So it's interesting how we see these different types of stuff. And the authoritarian also should be noted is also focused on humility and subordination to God. The only real power or authority is God, which of course in your daily life would be manifested in the husband or the father who has the most authority in the home. Now, education, there are debates about it, debates about education. We do actually, as I said with Benjamin Rush, we do start seeing the first calls for public education, the idea of education for all people, everyone in America. And of course, this went hand in hand with republicanism. A good Republican man would have been educated. A good Republican woman would have been educated as well to some degree. And so we start seeing increasing importance, especially for the elite. If you're a common person, you're a poor working class farmer or laborer, yes, you're still probably only going to primary school. But now we have primary school, secondary school, college, And then, of course, you were to be a professional. If you were an elite, that opportunity. Common Americans, simply primary school for a life of work and labor, farm, physical labor, things like that. The professional life at the time would have included much limited compared to what it is today. A business owner, professional farmer, which would have gone hand in hand with business, since professional farming was a business. Uh, Lawyer, minister, doctor, things like that. Much more focused on a handful of professions that were respectable professions. For instance, those ideas. But the common laborers, no. All you needed was the basic of primary, which would have been, I don't know, 5th grade, somewhere around there. So for the 1820s, most common people never attended school. They just didn't, or they only went to primary school. After 1820, we actually see the government start to take action. After the 1820s, we see government action to where we start creating public schools, public education, and we also start seeing the teaching of teachers. Yes, the teaching of teachers. Many colleges, universities open up for the sole purpose, initially, of training teachers. And then those teachers would then go out and train the next generations. We see that here in California. Another 30 years past this, California becomes a state, and many of the earliest colleges and universities in California, their sole purpose was to train teachers. That's all they did. And then things expanded beyond that to, of course, other programs. Um, we do start seeing this increase slowly in the time period. And, well, put it this way, 1820, the vast majority of Americans didn't go to any type of school beyond 5th grade. By 1910, 90% of all Americans went to high school. So in a 70-year period-ish, 70, 80 years, you go from almost no one in high school to almost everyone in high school. We do become, by the early 1900s, the best educated large country in the world. A common book that you would have used, a common reader, as we would call it, would have been used in primary school, Life of George Washington. I like to mention this simply because it gives you an idea of what you were. Everyone was supposed to aspire to be like George Washington. Honest, patriotic, a leader, courageous. You have to wonder if they promoted the fact that he was a slave owner in there. I've never read the book myself. You have to wonder. And if they did leave it out, it also makes you wonder. If they purposely left out him being a slave owner, did that say something? Did the people who wrote it actually already understand that maybe slavery was not a thing to brag about? Nonetheless, all of our early founding fathers were flawed. It's not an excuse, but George Washington was just one of thousands and thousands that owned slaves, so it's not an excuse or a pass for him. But it also has to be taken in context of many successful Southerners in the time period would have owned slaves. Doesn't take away from the fact that he was an American hero. Flawed, definitely flawed. So George Washington would have been looked at as heroic, as I said, as leader, as courageous, and hardworking, conscientious, good, the perfect American. The perfect American. These two images are interesting. We have two images here. The Cheney family, 1795. The Caverly family, 1836. Look at the differences. Here you have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12 people. Lots of children. We have a couple generations here. We have mother, father, and then we probably have daughter, maybe son-in-law. So we have at least 2 generations here, and then we have a third generation. The older kids of mother, father here probably, and then the younger kids of the daughter. So we have at least 3 generations here. Look at the way they're dressed. Look at the whole idea of the family. Men in the middle, The men are dominant in the middle of the picture here. The man stands taller. The father here is shown as much bigger than the others. Then look at this family from 30 years later, 40 years later. 2 children. Mother, book in front of her. Father, reading the newspaper. You can look here, you can see the son is holding, what is this, a level of some sort or a square of some sort. That indicates what he might be. He might be an architect. It looks like there's some plans on the table. So we have education, reading, 2 children, and we also can see status here. Look at the status here. This is a big family. They're dressed nicely. Probably are a upper class family. Same thing here. Family, dressed nicely, probably upper class. They have carpet on the floor. It should be understood most people did not have carpet. So the fact that they have carpet alone indicates some type of status. Fancy carpet. This is also Christmas time. You can't really read the bottom, but there's wreaths up here, and if you read the bottom, you see this is some type of Christmas, maybe a Christmas card picture of some sort of painting. You can see what is valued here. Here, there's no value on aesthetics. There's no value on fancy rugs, fancy chairs, education, aesthetics, pleasing paintings on the walls, fancy dress. Very, very fancy here. Very much middle class, enjoying their wealth, enjoying their status. Education is important for the children. Here, education. The only thing that's where there's a book in this picture is right here. The father's holding a book. Most likely that's a Bible. Education is not a focus here. Wealth and affluence is not a focus here. Showing off your status is not a focus here. All in all, these people here may very well have had as much money as these people, but they don't show it. The idea of status and social mobility and success and education become intrinsically, good word, part of the American culture. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is aristocratic republicanism and slavery. All right, but 1/3 of the population of the southern states were slaves. Now, there was some belief with the Revolution that we might actually see the end of slavery. Some people believe that, probably mostly in the North. They were incorrect, very sadly incorrect. Slavery does not end. It actually only expands, grows exponentially over the next, almost the next century after the Revolution. Part of the reason for this, of course, well, many of the Patriot leaders held slaves. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, many others were slave owners. Slavery was written into the Constitution, not by word, but effect. It was written in the 2/3 compromise we talked about before. Washington and Jefferson had hundreds of slaves. So slavery became synonymous with American prosperity, at least in the southern states. This contradiction, this constant contradiction, freedom versus slavery, it's pretty ironic that these people constantly talked about freedom, equality, republicanism, rights for all, when, of course, they left out about, well, I don't know, 50% of the population women, another 10% of the population black. They left out, what, 50, 60% of the population from their idea of freedom and equality for all. So it certainly has to be understood what they mean. Did they understand this contradiction? They did, actually. These weren't stupid men. Most of these were educated men. They wrote about it. They talked about it. The terms, well, I think I mentioned before, even was used the idea of slavery was a necessary evil. It was bad, it was evil, but necessary. In the turn of the century, 1800, the United States economy was founded really upon slavery. A majority of goods in America were either produced by slaves or sold to the slave society from other places that didn't have slaves. So, yeah. The idea of slavery ending might have been a dream for some, but it was unrecognized by most and unrealized. It just didn't happen. There were loyalists. There were actually quite a few loyalists in the Revolutionary War. Um, they fled to England. These were loyal to England. They fled to England. They fled to Canada. Afterwards, they found freedom there. England outlawed slavery in 1807, I believe. So this idea of freedom versus slavery, it was a dream. And if anything, the idea of freedom only became smaller and smaller as the years went by. Now, we do see a little bit right after the war. For instance, Virginia had a manumission law. Manumission, that is where you free your slaves. You free them usually over time. You manumit them. You give them freedom. Sometimes freedom for money. Sometimes you convert them into indentured servants. So in essence, you get freedom after you work for me for 5 years or 10 years or something like that. Um, Virginia actually does free over 10,000 slaves. However, that you actually see a pushback in Virginia. Virginia eventually outlaws manumission, making it illegal. So you get about a decade with the Virginia manumission law allowing you to free your slaves, and then they repeal that. They block it to where you can't free slaves anymore. And there's a good reason for that. Uh, if you start freeing slaves, that brings several questions to light. Can I free my slaves? If we're freeing them, does that mean it's bad to have slaves? Is there something wrong, immoral about having slaves? If it wasn't bad to have slaves, why would you be freeing them? So it brings a lot of questions to light. And of course, with the Southern economy based upon slavery, that would have been problematic had everyone suddenly let their slaves go. So, for a variety of reasons moral, social, economic, political, the manumission and gradual emancipation, that is where you gradually allow your slaves to have freedom over a time period, that is, I'm not going to say popular, but that certainly occurs in the late 1700s after the war. We see over 30,000 slaves either freed or escaped the country to Canada or England or other places. At the time, that was a significant number. It was. Over time, that would be nothing but a drop in the bucket of the millions of slaves America eventually happens. Now, in the North, there's actually some call for complete abolition. Abolition in this case meaning abolishing slavery or manumission. We do find that by 1804, all northern states, basically states north of Virginia, all northern states either have manumission laws or completely have abolished all slavery. Even though we never had many slaves in the North, it was always a small number, there still was slavery, and it wasn't illegal in most places. By 1804, it's pretty much illegal to own a slave in the northern states, or you must be in the process of freeing them by manumitting them or have turned them into indentured servants. Slavery is dying out in the North. It is going away, and it will soon not exist in the North at all. As I said, you typically had to buy your way to freedom, or you had to work it off as indentured servants. However, it should be noted that even when this happens, discrimination still remains. Prejudice, discrimination, segregation, none of that goes away. Black people are still treated as second or third class citizens. They're still very much uneducated and treated as less than white, less than a white person almost in all cases. So free, but not equal. In any way, shape, or form. Now, there was a lot of condemnation of slavery, like Quakers, for instance. We mentioned Quakers before. Quakers did not believe in slavery. So lots of condemnation of slavery. Abolitionists would claim that slaves had a low status, low education, poor situation, mental condition, because they were slaves. In other words, they were kept that way. They were kept as animals, practically, unable to get education or to elevate themselves up the social ladder. While slave owners would say they kept slaves because they were like that. Black people were simply inferior, unintelligent. They were little more than animals. This is what black leaders would often say, pardon me, slave leaders, slave masters, slave owners would often say. So the argument went both ways. It's hard to know if slave owners really believed it. Did the white masters really believe that blacks were inferior and stupid and a little better than animals? They treated them that way, and they used it to justify slavery in the slave society. We know from their writings and diaries, many of them didn't believe this. As Jefferson, I believe it was Jefferson that said it was a necessary evil. It was a bad thing, but we have to have it. Yeah. So we'll continue here. The defense of slavery was interesting. The defense of slavery took many forms. I mentioned one a moment ago, simply that slavery was necessary. It was part of Southern society. Um, let's face it, it's about money. It's about money. There were thousands of blacks that were free. About 10% of the black population was free. So thousands were free. They were common laborers, workers, a handful in the middle class. However, the vast majority of blacks were being used as slaves on plantations in the southern states. They generated, well, put it this way, the number one source of American gross domestic product was from slave labor. Slaves produced more goods than anything else as far as actual money, as far as money value. So it was about money. Don't get me wrong, they used race and prejudice and discrimination and this idea of racial superiority to justify it and enforce it. But at the end of the day, to give up slavery would have had to have, in most Southerners' minds, would have had to have given up their Southern way of life, give up their economy, to give up their entire white culture in the South. We do see a few. Again, we do have a few limited manumission. We saw there in Virginia. We see a few other places where they do have a little bit of releasing of slaves. Virginia, that was 82. But we do find that by 1800, it is illegal in just about every southern state to manumit your slaves. You simply can't free them. It's against the law. The only way you can free your slaves after 1800 is to literally sell everything you have and move to a northern state or one of the western states where slavery doesn't really expand, and then to free them there. And even that could be challenging. We even saw legal cases in court to where people would sue people moving to free states, saying that they still didn't have the right to release the slaves. Um, yeah, it's interesting. Slavery, as I said, was this idea of necessary evil. Thomas Jefferson did not ever release his slaves, for instance. But it was really also necessary to maintain white supremacy, the planter lifestyle. It was simply necessary to maintain Southern sociocultural norms, which had now been in place for, well, if you go to 1830, 1820, where we're in this chapter, we saw the first slaves almost 200 years before that. So the Southern way of life of white supremacy and black subservience had been ingrained into the Southern culture now for what, 10 generations? Uh, it's honestly surprising that, I say that differently. It would be surprising to think that anything other than absolute war could have ever ended slavery. And of course, that's what happens. Is the worst war America's ever been through is what finally ends slavery. I guess it shouldn't be surprising that that was what was necessary. Uh, Southerners were simply not going to give it up under any circumstance. No weakness could be shown. We had an interesting example here. Gabriel Prosser had an uprising, a slave uprising, Virginia, 1800 slave uprising. It was short-lived. They were captured, and him and all of his co-conspirators were hung. Over 30 people were executed, publicly executed, to demonstrate to the rest of Virginia, this is what happens. This is what happens if you attempt to overthrow white authority, try to free slaves in Virginia. Nothing short of death, humiliation, and violence. The argument was cemented by the early 1800s. The white master race and the black slave race in the southern states. It's really ironic if you think about it. While this was happening in the South, in the North, it was exactly opposite. In the North, slavery was ending. And by the early 1800s, there was no slavery in the northern states. So, of course, that seems to punch holes in their argument that slavery had to exist for the economy to thrive, when the northern economy thrived very successfully with no slaves. It really proves the southern argument rather false. Admittedly, a lot of northern goods were sold to the slave economy, but they also were sold around the world, especially, of course, to Europe. And now, from 1800 on, at least until the war in 1860, white master race, black subservient race, and there really was no other place for black-white relations in the southern states until the war, really. Well, the North and the South continue to grow apart all through this time period. It only gets worse and worse. They grow apart socio-culturally, they grow apart religiously, they grow apart economically, um, and slavery is maybe at the root of this. The differences in how the North and South see each other and relate to each other, the North becoming more industrial, more urban, much more of a diverse population, a lot of immigrants, much more equality. Don't get me wrong, not fair equality for all, but better. And the South, which pretty much freezes. The South almost stagnates as a purely agrarian, agricultural, white-black society, with the entirety of Southern society separated upon economic and racial lines. Um, Very interesting how the North and the South really seem to change. People that would visit America from Europe would note this, note how different it was, how the North and the South were so different. Um, the North was educated, very religious, ultra religious, again, New England. And the South was uneducated, very few public schools. The vast majority of blacks and whites were uneducated, vast amounts of poverty. Um, it really is interesting to note that all this wealth and prosperity the southern states generated, and they generated more wealth than the rest of America, the slave states did, all went into the hands of the top 5–10%. All went into the hands of the slave owners, the large planters, the aristocrats, and they were really aristocrats, really. Um, they took titles even at times. They called themselves lords sometimes, these plantation owners. So it really is interesting. More wealth in the South than the North, and yet it was all concentrated in the hands of a few people, a very small number of people who owned hundreds, even thousands of slaves. Um, Interesting how this disparity between the North and the South, and how everything seems to change, and how they become different places. Now, the slave trade ends in 1808, but that is only the purchase of slaves outside of America and selling them into America. There's problems with this. One, it only ends in the states. And what is not a state? District of Columbia. Washington is not a state. So there's actual slave trading that continues right in front of the Capitol, even though slave trading is technically illegal in the rest of the states. And the second part of this is only external slave trade. You can still, for instance, buy slaves in Virginia and transport them to Carolina, for instance, or Georgia or Tennessee. So you can buy and sell slaves within America. You simply can't buy them from outside the country. Well, the thing is, it doesn't matter anymore. Slave owners had no problem with this because slaves were naturally reproducing. They were naturally reproducing, so they didn't need to buy slaves from outside the country. Not to mention, it was actually probably cheaper to buy slaves domestically. Um, Slavery continues to grow and expand. By 1800, there's a little over 1 million slaves in America. By 1860, there are 4 million slaves in America. And pretty much all of that is through natural reproductive, natural growth here. Now, some people do challenge it. Some people speak out against it. There were anti-slave societies formed all across the U.S. Every state, hell, by the mid-1800s, practically every community in the North had anti-slave societies. At one point, there's well over 1,000 of them across the country that are challenging and speaking out against slavery. The Haitian Revolution is the only successful slave revolt in the Americas. Haiti was almost entirely black. They revolt. They overthrow the French, who had the colony at the time, the Haitian colony. They overthrow the French, and for several years, Haiti is independent and free, the only successful one. So maybe that sparked some hope for some people. Hope that, well, if the Haitians could do it, couldn't others do it? It never happened in America. Matter of fact, we never even got close to that. There was never a revolt that involved more than a few dozen people, and they were quickly put down, usually resulting in mass executions of everyone involved. So this never was realized in America. We see all kinds of anti-slave societies trying to push against slavery. Well, thing is, slavery only became more and more in demand because of cotton. As cotton actually became, they use the term king cotton. Cotton became the new material for all clothing. All clothing goods, all textile goods were being made of cotton by the mid-1800s. And the cotton was being produced in large numbers. We became the #1 cotton exporter in the world by the mid-1800s. Almost all of it produced by slaves. The money, well, cotton was practically gold. It was so valuable. Slavery was never going to end. As I indicated, 10, 15 minutes ago, it was never going to end short of absolute violence and destruction, which is what, of course, we get. Now, there are some things used, some type of success, and I put on my slide here limited success. I really should have put in parentheses very limited success. Very limited. The American Colonization Societies created, the American Colonization, which was to take African slaves, free them, and then recolonize them in Africa. So in other words, colonize them back to Africa. Problems with this. One, most African slaves in America were not from Africa. Most slaves in America by this time period were born here. They had never set foot in Africa. Most slaves didn't want Africa. They wanted America freedom. They wanted to stay here where their family, friends, maybe their ancestors had lived and died. They wanted to stay here. They simply wanted to be free as Americans. They didn't want to be recolonized back to Africa. They didn't want to leave. The ACS is not successful at all. Only about 6,000 slaves were ever recolonized back to Africa, which was nothing, really. We even create a country. We create a country in Africa known as Liberia, which would stand for the place of liberty, the place of liberty, Liberia. So we even create this country in Africa for these slaves to go back there. Very, very small number. Lots of resistance from blacks. Lots of resistance from even free blacks. No interest in going back there. The blood, the sweat, the tears, the family connections, most of them had no interest. They simply wanted to stay here and be Americans. So it must be understood that what success there was with the handful of African Americans who did try to challenge this, and it should be noted, there were black people speaking out. Not really in the South. In the South, if you were black, even free, and you spoke out, you would find yourself in serious trouble. But in the North, you do have blacks that do speak out, that do become a part of abolitionist societies. We see a handful of black free voices really speaking out. However, they were under constant threat, even in the North, of terrorism and attacks and violence. Even in the North. Speaking of abolition was not popular. It needs to be clear. Most people did not support abolition, even in the North. It doesn't mean that they supported slavery. It needs to be understood that most people in the North were ambivalent. Most folks in the North had never seen a slave, never dealt with slaves. If they'd ever seen a black person, it was a free black person. So the reality is most people in the North simply didn't care enough about it to really support abolition. And if they did care about it, they thought abolition was dangerous. because to talk about abolition, well, people are already talking about potential of war or violence. That's already on people's lips by 1820. So either they avoid it, or they resist it, or they simply don't care about it. And of course, in the South, even though there might have been people who were for abolition, you didn't speak out about it openly. You would find yourself destroyed. They would destroy your career. They'd burn your house. They'd chase you out of town. They would shut down your business. They would fire you from your job. They might burn your house. They might terrorize your children. And that was if you were white. If you were black and spoke out about abolition, very well could find yourself hanging or swinging from a tree. So, yeah. By 1820, abolition wasn't really a thing. There was a handful of people talking about it. We have a few limited places where a few blacks do get freed. Very few. It simply is not an issue that Americans in general are willing to take up at this point in time. Here we see freedom, dates when slavery eliminated in the red states up here, these red states up here, 1780s, 1770s, 1780s. Gradual abolition, New York, Pennsylvania, down to Virginia. And then, of course, we have these states which never abolished slavery. These become all slave states. Virginia, Kentucky, down to here. And, of course, Missouri, which we're going to talk about in a second. Missouri, which does become the only slave state really north of Virginia. As well. Let's see what else I want to see on here. Yeah, nothing else really on this particular map. Just shows you where slavery is, and also you get to see the size of America in this point in time, where we are. Really? Still just getting started. Still only about 15 states, give or take. All right. Now, the last thing we'll talk about this in the chapter, the end of this chapter, is the Missouri Crisis. So the Missouri Crisis from 1819 to 1821. Very heated debate. Heated debate about adding this new territory. And the debate was really not about, adding a territory. Everybody wanted to expand and continue to grow. Part of this agrarian vision we talked about. This is still part of that Virginia dynasty we mentioned. But the issue was over slavery. Well, Congress shows itself to be abolitionist. Congress votes to add the Missouri Territory without slavery. No slavery. Now, here's the deal. We had already set rules on this, that any state was allowed to write their own constitution, and they had basically sovereignty to design their own state guidelines, their own constitution, which would presumably have allowed them to choose slavery. Well, Missouri wants slavery. They write it into their constitution. Congress says, no, we will not admit you with slavery. You must take slavery out of your constitution if you want to be admitted. Well, that leads us to a problem, crisis. Let me see if I have it here on a map. I'll show you the map. There's the Missouri Territory we're talking about. Wanting to be added as a slave state, that was the Missouri Constitution, and Congress in Washington decided differently. Well, that leads us to this crisis. Around the same time, there was also in the works to add another state, Maine, up in the New England area. So Missouri is going to be added, Maine is going to be added. Well, here's what happens. The delegates, there were delegates in Congress, actually blocked this from happening, Maine being added. So they approved Missouri as a free state, but then other people in Congress said they would block Maine being added as a free state unless they allowed Missouri to be slave. So, in other words, if certain groups in Congress would not approve Missouri as a slave state, they would not get Maine as a free state. And the argument for this was threefold, that we should allow Missourians to have equal rights. And in this case, this is the rights of the Missouri population who voted on the Constitution, the Missouri Constitution. They should have the right to choose slavery if that's what they want. The states should be sovereign. There was a belief that the states, especially under the Virginia dynasty, that the states should have sovereignty. They should be able to decide their own future and make their own rules. And furthermore, slaveholders argued Say they lived in Virginia and wanted to move to Missouri. Well, a good example to give you is if a person owned a wagon in Virginia and then moved to Missouri, would they still own that wagon? Of course they would. It's their wagon. They owned it. The argument is therefore made that slaves are considered property. The term is chattel, chattel slavery. Slaves are property, the same as a wagon or a horse. Therefore, if I move to another state, I should have the right to keep my property. Of course, if slavery was outlawed in Missouri, then you wouldn't be able to keep your property. Interestingly enough, all of these are valid arguments. All these are valid arguments. Other states up to this point had been able to choose their own course and make their own laws. The states had been considered sovereign, able to make their own rules. And, of course, this idea of owning property, since slaves were considered property by most. So, as tragic as it is, the Missourians and the Missouri legislature actually had valid arguments, legally speaking, that they should have the right to do this. They also do something further. They start changing how they talk about slavery. They stop talking about slavery as a necessary evil and start talking about slavery as what they call a positive good. Slavery is a good thing. Many times talking about how slavery is in the Bible, how slavery gives protection, shelter, employment, healthcare, what limited healthcare. In essence, slave owners were actually taking care of the slaves. They were protecting them, giving them jobs, giving them money, giving them food and shelter. Slavery is a good thing, is the argument made by Southerners by the 1820s, using religious and, of course, the arguments that I just made there. So, we should allow slavery, is what they would say. There's no reason not to allow it. It's a good thing. And, of course, all the legal reasons behind it, tradition reasons behind it. Well, what we end up with is what's known as the Missouri Compromise. Senator Henry Clay, I believe is a senator, ran for president 4 or 5 times. Senator Henry Clay makes a proposal, what we end up eventually calling the Missouri Compromise. It takes over 2 years to do this. 2 years of debate and discussion and controversy and literally fighting. Not kidding. There's incidents in this time period where congressional people in Congress, on the floor of Congress, actually got into fights. Fist fights, punching and hitting each other with their fists and their canes. Yes. People, the highest echelon of American society, the elite politicians, took to fisticuffs, is the word we'd use, to over the issue of slavery, fighting either for or against it. Boy, that would have been a sight to see. A bunch of old white guys swinging at each other on the floor of Congress. That would have been interesting. So this compromise that Henry Clay suggests, we call it Missouri Compromise. And the agreement is simple. Maine will be admitted as a free state in 20, and Missouri as a slave state in 21. Everybody gets what they want. Missouri gets their free state, and Maine gets their slave state. Now, certainly there's some people in Congress that weren't happy about this. They did not want Missouri added as a slave state. However, this is what must be done to keep the peace. And why is this compromise so significant? Compromises like this are the only thing that keep us out of war for the next 40 years. It's just that simple. We have a compromise in 30, 20, 30, 40, 50, almost every decade. We have another type of compromise over expansion of slavery. Every one of them is about the expansion of slavery. And each time we come up with a compromise to try and keep our country together, to keep it from exploding into violence and, chaos, frankly. It sets this precedent, which we then follow for, the next 40 years, give or take. The 3630 line, this line right here. This 3630 line is established. This is that longitude? Longitude, I think. This longitudinal line of 3630 says, henceforward, everything above this line will be free, and below will be slave. Odd that they set that line there when you consider you have, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, those are all slave states. But from now on, everything above that line will be free, everything below slave. That is that line. And we keep that on the books for about 30 years? Till about 1850. We changed it in 1850. So for 30 years, all the rest of the states we add, which of course will be this entire territory here, are pretty much free or slave. This is the precedent that it sets. It manages to keep the peace. It manages to keep, other than that, those incidents on the floor of Congress, it managed to actually keep us out of conflict. Looking back, hindsight's 2020, right? Looking back, we can say very clearly, all it did was delay the inevitable. In 1820, did people think it was inevitable we would go to war? Probably not most. They couldn't see what was coming. As tragic as what was coming. All right, so that ends chapter 8 here. That's everything we're going to talk about in this chapter. And I thank you for watching. We will see you in chapter 9.